1492. Three small ships push into an ocean no European map could explain. Their sails swell against the wind. Their wooden hulls creak like fragile bones. And on their decks stand men who believe they are chasing paradise. History remembers their commander, Christopher Columbus. For centuries, his name was etched into school books as a fearless navigator, the man who discovered America and connected two worlds. Streets, cities, even entire holidays were built in his honor. Statues rose in public squares, gazing proudly into the distance, as if he were a saint of exploration. But history also knows how to hide its shadows. What if behind the story of bravery lies a truth drenched in suffering? What if those same ships carried not only faith and ambition, but also conquest, slavery, and one of the greatest demographic collapses in human history? This is not simply a tale of discovery. It is a story of illusions, of a man who believed he had reached Asia, yet stumbled upon a world that would be forever changed, not by triumph, but by tragedy. So our journey begins here, not with the myth of a lone hero, but with the darker truth of ambition, greed, and consequences too vast to fit inside any textbook. Welcome to Chronicle of Secret. Tonight, we peel back the legend of Columbus and confront the silence history has tried to bury. But to understand how a man could carry both discovery and destruction across the same waves, we have to go back, before the voyage, before the statues, before the legend. Columbus was not born a hero. He was born in Genoa, the son of a wool weaver, in a world still haunted by plague and hungry for trade. He grew up in an age where maps were incomplete, seas were uncharted, and fortune favored those willing to gamble everything on the horizon. It was here, in the crowded ports of the Mediterranean, that his obsession with the ocean began. Christopher Columbus was born in Genoa around 1451, at a moment when Europe felt both haunted and hungry. Haunted by the recent memory of plague, hungry for the silk, spice, and gold that smelled like distant rain. By mid-century, wealth no longer came from lords and fields alone. It rode on ships, along routes that behaved like arteries. Clog one, and the body of trade gasped. The Ottomans had their hands on the main overland passage to Asia. Prices rose, patience thinned. A continent began asking a simple, dangerous question. What if there is another way? Columbus grew up far from palaces, a wool weaver's son who watched fortunes change not by birth, but by wind. Genoa's docks were a classroom and a temptation. Bales of cloth moved beside barrels of oil and salt fish. Alongside them, rumors moved faster, of islands half seen, of pilots who had felt land in fog, of charts that hinted at shortcuts. If you were a young man with a head for risk, you learned quickly that the sea didn't care about your surname. By the 1470s, he had migrated to Portugal, the workshop of Atlantic seamanship. There, shipwrights thinned hulls and flexed keels. Navigators copied windroses onto portolan charts. Pilots mastered the volta do mar, the counterintuitive turn of the sea that trades distance for certainty by looping with the winds. Portuguese caravels were nibbling down Africa's coast, planting forts and questions. Columbus lived inside that fermentation, listening, learning, and, crucially, arguing. He read what men could read then: travelers' accounts, compendia of cosmography, compilations of winds and distances. He inhaled Marco Polo, where facts and fables slept in the same bed. And from those pages, he stitched together a vision that felt both brilliant and flawed. If the earth is round, sail west long enough, and you touch Asia's eastern hem. That is true in principle. The trap is in the numbers. Here is the uncomfortable part, the part that separates myth from method. The learned world of his day already understood a large earth. Their objection wasn't shape, but scale. Columbus wasn't the only round earther. He was the most stubborn underestimator. He compressed the globe, stretched Asia, and accepted mileage figures that shaved oceans into ponds. Was it wishful arithmetic? A translation tangle between different miles? A gambler's bias? Likely some of each. But this is the hinge. He wasn't defying medieval ignorance. He was defying reasonable caution. Portugal, pragmatic and data-driven from decades of Atlantic practice, heard him out and declined. Their pilots knew the discipline of supply and the tyranny of distance. If Asia lay that far west, no ship of the day could carry enough water and biscuit to survive the crossing, plus the return. Columbus left those rooms without a patron, but with his audacity intact. His gaze slid to Spain, a kingdom that in 1492 was tasting the afterglow of victory. Granada had fallen, banners snapped in cold winter air, sermons braided triumph with Providence. Spain felt chosen, historically, theologically, and now perhaps geographically. Columbus understood his audience. He spoke the languages that mattered to Isabella and Ferdinand: profit and piety. "Underwrite my westward passage," he argued, "and I will open a direct artery to Asia's goods and a path for souls toward your faith." Ambition alone didn't sell the idea. Framing did. He promised a monarch's ledger, spices, dyes, precious metals, and an evangel's ledger, baptisms, churches, prestige. In that pitch lies the double helix that would soon organize an empire. Oro y Dios, gold and God. To a court consolidating power and reputation, it sounded like destiny with a business plan. But even that was not quite enough. Royal councils are built to say no slowly. The months stretched, the petitions multiplied, the sums were reworked and re-argued. Columbus's critics were not small minds, they were sober ones. What finally tipped the scale? A convergence. Spain's appetite to rival Portugal, the lure of a monopoly before anyone else dared the gamble, and a persuasive, if mistaken, arithmetic wrapped in missionary zeal. The risk felt enormous, but if he was right, the payoff would rebalance the world. There is a quieter layer to his ambition, and it matters for what comes later. Columbus was not merely seeking patronage, he was negotiating identity. He pushed for titles, Admiral of the Ocean Sea, and hereditary privileges. He wanted status baked into law, a permanent seat at history's table. To ask for that before you have proven a route is either madness or genius. Often, in exploration, it is both. Meanwhile, the toolkit sharpened. Charts accumulated stains of oil and salt. Knots were practiced in the dark. Hourglasses were calibrated so that time could be sliced into watch bells. Dead reckoning, the delicate art of inferring where you are from, where you were, would do the heavy lifting once the shoreline disappeared behind a blue axle of horizon. Every instrument had a bias. Every measurement bred a small lie. The only antidote was discipline and faith in both senses. Was he aware of the holes in his plan? He had to be. He simply judged that boldness could outrun arithmetic. This is where the mystery of temperament enters. Why some minds, when faced with good counter-arguments, choose the ocean anyway. To Columbus, the longer route down Africa felt like someone else's victory lap. The West looked empty, and therefore full. Spain finally said yes. Not a resounding chorus, more like a consent edged with caveats. But yes is the only word that matters when the tide is right. And so, a weaver's son with borrowed authority walked the quay at Palos de la Frontera and counted hulls. 3 ships, fewer than 100 men, enough biscuit to survive the guess. The rest belonged to wind, will, and the arithmetic he believed could be bullied into submission. What he did not know, what no one in that moment could fully know, was that he had set 2 fuses at once. One aimed at Asia, imagined and near. The other ran invisibly through lives he had not yet seen, cultures he did not yet name, and consequences that would outlive his bones. On paper, it was a plan for trade. In practice, it was a plan to redraw the human map. Spain had finally said yes. The petitions, the doubts, the arithmetic wars, all of it collapsed into a single word that would change history. Columbus, the wool weaver's son who dared to argue with empires, now had ships under his command. But a question hung in the salty air of Palos. Was this boldness, Or was it madness dressed as destiny? Only the ocean could answer. Spain had finally said, yes. After years of rejection and arguments, after endless calculations and debates, Columbus was granted the ships he demanded. A wool weaver's son who had learned to speak the language of monarchs now stood on the docks of Palos de la Frontera with 3 vessels under his command. The question lingered among sailors and skeptics alike. Was this vision genius or folly disguised as faith? On the morning of August 3rd, 1492, the Niña, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria slipped their moorings and drifted into the tide. Fewer than 100 men sailed with him, some veterans hardened by Portuguese voyages, others debtors, prisoners, and drifters who had little to lose. For many, the sea was not a choice, but a sentence. The first days carried them south to the Canary Islands, a familiar harbor where ships paused to repair and resupply before the greater unknown. There, delays already gnawed at morale. The Pinta's rudder broke, and precious weeks vanished in repairs. Yet once the sails caught the September winds and turned westward, the men understood. They were leaving maps behind. The known world dissolved at their backs. Imagine the nights on those waters. Planks creaking, ropes snapping in the wind, waves heaving against fragile hulls. Above them, the sky spread like an endless atlas of cold fire. They relied on dead reckoning, hourglasses, and instinct. No coastline, no lighthouse. Only faith in a commander whose conviction was louder than reason. But conviction has limits. As days bled into weeks, anxiety hardened into whispers. Some claimed Columbus lied in his logbooks, reporting fewer miles than they had actually sailed. Was it caution to calm them, or deception to control them? Each sunrise without land deepened the doubt. Mutiny was no longer a distant rumor, but a possibility sharpening like a knife in the dark. Then came signs, birds wheeling overhead far from shore. A green branch floating on the swell, fresh as if cut yesterday. A carved stick drifting by, hinting at unseen hands. These fragments teased the men with hope and taunted them with the possibility of mirage. On the night of October 11th, a sailor aboard the Pinta cried out. A faint white line shimmered against the horizon. The men held their breath through the long hours. And when dawn lit the sea, there it was. An island, low and green, rising from the water like an answer to desperate prayers. Columbus came ashore, planting banners and declaring the land for Spain. He called it San Salvador. He believed, with the confidence of a gambler who refuses to check his math, that he had reached Asia's outskirts. The men cheered not for geography, but for survival. They had risked the abyss, and the abyss had finally given them ground. Yet discovery is rarely what it seems. What stood before them was not Asia, not Cathay or Cipango, but islands with people who smiled, shared food, and wore gold ornaments that glinted like promises in the sun. In that moment, the voyage transformed. The question was no longer, is there land? But what can be taken from it? They came ashore to smiles, not spears. The Taino, generous and unarmed, offered food, water, even parrots and cotton as gifts. To the weary Spaniards, it must have felt like stepping into a living paradise, an island of innocence rising from the sea. Some even whispered that perhaps Eden itself had been found. But Columbus's gaze was different. He was not measuring kindness, he was measuring utility. In his journal, he wrote that the islanders would make good servants. With 50 men, he claimed, he could rule them all. Where the Taino saw guests, he saw subjects. Where one sailor admired hospitality, he calculated obedience. And then came the mistake that became a myth. He called them Indians. Believing he had skirted the edges of Asia, Columbus imposed a name that was wrong and devastatingly sticky. That single word erased countless cultures, compressing them into a false identity that would cling for centuries. The irony is striking. He thought he had discovered truth, but he had only discovered the power of illusion. Gold was the spark that burned through the illusion. The Taino wore small ornaments of the metal, enough to catch the sunlight, and, with it, European greed. Columbus asked where it came from. Fingers pointed toward distant islands. And suddenly, the horizon was no longer a mystery to be crossed, but a treasure map to be plundered. The voyage that began as a daring gamble had transformed into a hunt. The hunt required proof. Captives were seized, not as enemies, but as guides, trophies, and evidence to be paraded before the Spanish crown. The meaning of the expedition shifted in real time. Exploration was no longer about discovery, it was about justification. It was about returning with enough bodies, gold, and stories to guarantee the next fleet would be larger, richer, and more ruthless. And here is the chilling paradox. Columbus believed he had arrived at Asia. Yet every detail contradicted him. The languages, the plants, the faces. Instead of questioning, he forced reality into the mold of his expectations. This is what makes the illusion so haunting. He didn't just misread the map, he misread the people standing before him. From the decks of 3 fragile ships, it might have looked like triumph. Land claimed, banners raised, God and crown served. But beneath the surface, something darker stirred. In those first friendly handshakes lay the blueprint for conquest. What seemed like discovery was, in fact, the quiet beginning of a tragedy that would outlast every captain and every king. The men cheered their survival. Columbus celebrated his illusion, and somewhere beyond the waves, history itself held its breath, waiting for the cost to be revealed. When Columbus returned to Spain in 1493, he carried more than stories. He paraded captives, Taino men torn from their islands, before the crown, as if human lives were evidence to be displayed. He carried trinkets of gold, so small they barely filled a chest, yet bright enough to blind the imagination of Europe. To Isabella and Ferdinand, it was enough. The gates of empire seemed to creak open. They rewarded him with a title, Admiral of the Ocean Sea, and with it, authority few outsiders had ever won. But most of all, they gave him another fleet. This time, it was not 3 fragile ships whispering across the Atlantic. It was 17 vessels heavy with settlers, priests, soldiers, and steel. What had begun as an experiment was now unmistakably a conquest. Gold and God marched side by side. Spain demanded both. The monarchs wanted treasure to rival Portugal and souls to rival Islam. This twin hunger, profit and piety, became the DNA of empire. To Columbus, it was the perfect script. Promise riches for the crown, salvation for the church, and power for himself. When the fleet thundered back into the Caribbean, the islands that had once seemed like paradise quickly became a battlefield. Hispaniola was chosen as the heart of Spain's new dominion. But gold did not flow as promised. Streams yielded dust, not nuggets. Mines swallowed more hope than they gave. Columbus answered the disappointment with a brutal solution: quotas of tribute. Every Taino above a certain age was ordered to deliver gold. Those who obeyed received a token to hang around the neck. Those who failed met punishments so cruel they read like nightmares. Hands severed, villages burned, bodies displayed as warnings. The very people who had greeted strangers with gifts now lived under the shadow of terror. Religion offered no refuge. Priests baptized quickly, sometimes with one hand, while soldiers shackled with the other. Salvation was preached in the morning, and forced labor began by afternoon. Faith became another tool of empire, its language twisted into chains. And Columbus? He relished his new role. No longer the supplicant begging for sponsorship, he stood as ruler of lands he barely understood. In letters, he styled himself both missionary and monarch, claiming to serve God and crown, while quietly building a vision of dynastic rule. He demanded titles, privileges, and hereditary rights, as if the new world were already his private kingdom. What unfolded in those first years was more than exploration. It was the birth of colonization, the moment curiosity gave way to conquest. The dream of finding Asia had collapsed, but in its place rose something darker, a system built on extraction, domination, and the promise that more would always lie just beyond the horizon. It seemed triumphant. 17 ships, banners flying, a monarch's blessing secured. Yet beneath the fanfare, something sinister was already spreading. The quiet catastrophe of lives broken, cultures shattered, and an epidemic not of faith, but of greed. At first, Spain's foothold in the Caribbean looked fragile. A handful of forts, scattered settlers, and Columbus clinging to promises of gold that refused to materialize. But fragility on paper can still carry a terrible weight, especially when the imbalance of power is so extreme. For the Taino, what followed was not a clash of armies, but a collapse of worlds. The catastrophe began invisibly. The newcomers brought with them stowaways smaller than dust, pathogens the Taino had never encountered: smallpox, measles, influenza. To European bodies, these diseases were cruel but familiar. To the islanders, they were apocalyptic. Entire villages withered in weeks. Survivors staggered into forests, carrying contagion to those who had never seen a Spaniard. Within a generation, populations that once numbered in the hundreds of thousands had shrunk to remnants. And disease was only the first blow. The second was slavery, sharpened into system. Columbus ordered quotas of gold so unrealistic that failure was inevitable. When quotas failed, punishments fell. Men were marched into mines until their bodies gave out. Women were seized as concubines or forced to carry burdens through the hills. Children died, not only of sickness, but of exhaustion. The encomienda, the template for forced labor that Spain would replicate across the Americas, was born here, in blood and despair. Even resistance collapsed into tragedy. Some Taino chose flight, vanishing into mountains to starve rather than submit. Others took their own lives, refusing to live under the shadow of chains. Mothers drowned infants rather than see them branded as slaves. Desperation was not an act of rebellion. It was the only freedom left. Reports from the time are chilling. Bartolomé de las Casas, a Spanish friar who witnessed the conquest, wrote of rivers running red and mountains echoing with screams. He recorded scenes of cruelty so extreme they seemed medieval in their sadism. Hands severed, bodies hunted with dogs, villages burned alive. He would later call it a genocide, centuries before the word existed. By the year 1517, just 25 years after Columbus's arrival, Hispaniola's Taino population had plummeted from an estimated 250,000, or perhaps more, to barely a few thousand. The rest had been consumed by disease, labor, despair, and the machinery of empire. This was not an accident of history. It was not the side effect of discovery. It was the engine of colonization grinding its gears for the first time. And its noise was so loud, its consequences so devastating, that they would echo across continents for centuries. What began as 3 ships searching for Asia had become the opening act of one of the greatest human catastrophes the world had ever known. And yet, for Columbus, this devastation was written into letters as opportunity. Less resistance, more land to claim, more room for settlers to expand. The silence of the vanished was twisted into evidence of victory. But history does not stay silent forever. The bones beneath Hispaniola's soil still whisper. And they remind us that what empire celebrated as triumph was, in truth, the quietest apocalypse, a disappearance so vast it nearly erased memory itself. He had once returned to Spain, hailed as the Admiral of the Ocean Sea. But by the year 1500, the rumors spreading across the Atlantic painted a different man, ruthless, erratic, incapable of ruling the lands he claimed. The crown could not ignore the voices. Settlers starving, soldiers deserting, priests whispering of atrocities. Columbus's empire, barely born, was already rotting. The monarchs sent Francisco de Bobadilla with royal authority to investigate. What he found was not the orderly colony promised, but chaos and resentment. Within weeks, Columbus was placed in chains. Picture it. The man who had once stood before Ferdinand and Isabella, demanding titles, now sat shackled on the deck of a ship, the Atlantic wind rattling his irons. He refused to let the chains be removed, declaring they would serve as proof of his suffering. To him, they were symbols of martyrdom. To others, they were simply evidence of disgrace. Though released after returning to Spain, the humiliation was permanent. His authority was stripped, his reputation cracked. He was allowed to sail again, but only under strict limits, and never again to Hispaniola. He touched Trinidad, glimpsed the South American mainland, traced the coast of Central America. Yet each voyage felt smaller, his influence slipping away, while others, Ojeda, Vespucci, Balboa, pushed further and claimed more. Illness shadowed him. Dysentery racked his body. His mind drifted toward visions that blurred faith with fantasy. In letters, he spoke of rivers flowing from the Garden of Eden, of lands destined by God as the new center of the world. His words no longer read like a navigator's reports, but like the confessions of a man drowning in his own illusions. By 1506, Columbus lay dying in Valladolid. The court was preoccupied with new conquests, new riches. He remained convinced he had reached Asia, clinging to the illusion even as history moved beyond him. He had opened the door to the New World, but he could not control what storm came rushing through. And yet, the story does not end with his deathbed. For what Columbus left behind was larger than any man, larger even than the empire he served. He left behind a question that still divides the world. Was he a hero of courage or the architect of catastrophe? The answer, like the man himself, lies tangled in shadow. Columbus died in Valladolid in 1506, his body frail, his reputation fractured. He left this world still clinging to the illusion that he had reached Asia, still insisting the maps would one day prove him right. But history rarely obeys the illusions of men. For Spain, his voyages had already unlocked an empire. Other captains stormed through the door he had opened. Vespucci, Balboa, Cortés, Pizarro, each carving territories, each chasing gold and glory. Within decades, the Caribbean and the Americas were no longer mysteries but colonies, their wealth feeding the engines of Europe. Columbus, once the central figure, became a shadow at the edge of his own story. The man who lit the match but could not control the fire. Yet memory clung to him. In Europe, his name was gilded as a symbol of courage, the sailor who proved the ocean could be crossed. In the United States, centuries later, immigrants embraced him as a hero, raising statues and parades in his honor, turning Columbus Day into a ritual of pride. For them, he was proof that the forgotten and the outcast could still write themselves into history. But memory is a double-edged blade. For indigenous peoples, Columbus was not a hero, but a harbinger of catastrophe. His arrival marked the beginning of disease, dispossession, and cultural erasure. Every statue of Columbus was, to them, not a monument, but a wound cast in bronze. To celebrate him felt like celebrating the moment their world began to unravel. And so, the debate over his legacy rages on. Some see in him bravery, vision, the audacity to sail where no one dared. Others see brutality, arrogance, and the arrogance of calling devastation discovery. Both are true, and neither cancels the other. Columbus stands as a paradox, a man of immense courage and devastating consequence. This is the real weight of history. It forces us to hold two truths in the same hand, no matter how they burn. To remember only the triumph is to lie. To remember only the tragedy is to forget the risk that changed the world. Legacy lives in the tension between them. Stand on the Caribbean shore today, and the waves look calm. But listen closely, and the silence carries voices. Languages lost, songs erased, stories smothered by conquest. That silence is as much a monument as any statue. It whispers that discovery is never innocent, that every voyage carves both wonder and wound. And perhaps this is the final secret Columbus leaves us, that history is not about heroes or villains, but about what we choose to see in the shadows. Stand at the edge of the Caribbean as the sun sinks into the sea. The water is calm, the horizon endless. If you close your eyes, you can almost see them. 3 fragile ships cutting across the waves, their sails swollen with hope, their decks heavy with illusions. But beneath that calm surface lies another truth. Bones resting in silence, languages swallowed by time, stories buried so deep they whisper only to the tides. What the world called discovery was, for countless others, the beginning of disappearance. Columbus opened the Atlantic world, but the price was carved into the lives that vanished, the songs that fell silent, the legacies we may never fully recover. And so the question is not only, what did Columbus discover? But what are we willing to remember? And what do we still choose to forget? This is Chronicle of Secret. And the real secret of Columbus is that triumph and tragedy were born on the same tide in 1492. If these hidden truths matter to you, stay with us. There are more mysteries waiting. Secrets of lost civilizations, ancient wonders, and the untold stories that still shape our world. Subscribe, share, and return for the next chapter. Because history always has another secret.